I'm Clara, a 35-year-old housewife, married to Leo for 10 years. He works for a trading company, and we have a daughter in elementary school. With Leo traveling a lot for work, it was challenging when our daughter was younger. But he always made time for video calls, and she adored him. Despite his absences, I never felt lonely. We were a happy, close-knit family. However, things weren't always perfect. I had a friend, Jane, who turned hostile toward me. We lived in the same apartment building. Our kids went to the same kindergarten, and we were on the PTA together. For years, we were close, but something changed. She began harassing me. I tried to fix things between us, but her behavior only got worse. The trouble started when we bought a house. We had been living in the same rental complex as Jane, but when our daughter started school, we moved into a new single-family home. It was a big decision, but it felt right. The house was in a great location, near a supermarket and the station, with a big yard for our daughter to play in. I was so grateful to Leo for his hard work, and I focused even more on taking care of our home and family. Jane didn't like our new situation. She grew cold after we moved. At first, I didn't understand why. We used to visit each other's homes often, but suddenly she started ignoring me and even glaring at me with contempt. It all became clear during our children's school entrance ceremony. Afterward, as we were leaving, she whispered in my ear, "You think you're better than everyone else just because you bought a house. I'm disappointed in you." Then she walked away. I was shocked. I never bragged about our new home and still wanted to be friends, even after our kids started school. I tried to mend our relationship, but she wouldn't budge. Instead, she spread false rumors, claiming I had become arrogant after buying the house. Luckily, no one believed her, and some friends even sympathized with me. Though others were supportive, I constantly worried about what Jane might do next. Fortunately, our children never ended up in the same class, and eventually, Jane stopped bothering me. By the time my daughter reached 3rd grade, I had put the whole ordeal behind me. Life was peaceful again, or so I thought. I had underestimated Jane's persistence. One morning, after sending my daughter to school, the doorbell rang. I answered the intercom and saw 2 police officers standing outside. A police car was parked in front of the house. My heart raced, but I tried to stay calm, thinking they might be here about something in the neighborhood. I told myself, it's okay, and slowly opened the door. One of the officers asked, "Is your husband at home?" They weren't here for me, but for Leo. I began to explain that he wasn't home, but then the officer's next words nearly stopped my heart. "Your husband is suspected of molestation." I gasped, covering my mouth with both hands. The thought of the neighbors finding out was terrifying. The police explained that a woman had accused him of inappropriate behavior on a train. I knew Leo could never do such a thing and insisted they had made a mistake. But the officer warned, "If you hide him, you'll be arrested too." I was stunned, knowing Leo was innocent, when Jane suddenly appeared behind the officers, smirking. At first, I thought she was just being nosy, but she wasn't. Ignoring the officers, she barged into my house and said, "If you don't want him arrested, I might consider settling for some compensation money." Jane was the one who reported my husband. The officers seemed uneasy with her talk of a settlement, but she continued, "I was really scared," and began describing the incident with a pained expression. She claimed she was on a train when someone suddenly touched her. She almost screamed, but then recognized the face. It was my husband. She hesitated to turn him in because he was her friend's husband. Before she could decide, he vanished into the crowd at the next station, so she decided to report it to the police later. With tearful eyes, she pointed at me, saying, Molestation is a serious crime, officer. Arrest her too. If she had truly been assaulted, her fear and determination to catch the culprit would be understandable. And if I were hiding the criminal, I could be just as guilty. But this situation was different. My husband couldn't have committed the crime. How could she fabricate such a story and act so convincingly? I resolved to expose her lies completely. Time to get serious. I wasn't going to hold back. "I'm sorry to trouble you by coming all the way here," I told the officers. "But my husband has been overseas on assignment for 3 years." Overseas? The officers looked shocked. Yes, he had been out of the country for 3 long years. Just after we moved into our new home, his company sent him abroad. When he first told me, I felt like my world was falling apart. It's not unusual to hear about people being transferred right after buying a house, but his assignment was overseas. And it wasn't to a place we could easily visit. This time, it was a long-term assignment, not just a brief business trip. Although I was used to his frequent travels, I was deeply disappointed because our dream home was just completed. But we couldn't refuse the company's orders. I considered moving overseas with him, but our daughter had just started school and made close friends in the neighborhood. She wanted to stay and go to school with her friends, so I decided to stay here with her. So, as soon as we moved into our new house, it was just the 2 of us. At first, living alone in a big house was unsettling, but we stayed in touch with video calls almost every day. The spacious new home allowed me to enjoy my gardening hobby, so I wasn't as lonely as I expected. That's why my husband has never lived in our new home. He's been overseas for 3 years. There's no way he could have committed any crime on a domestic train. When I explained this, the police officers looked confused and started to question everything. The one most taken aback was Jane. "That's a lie. It must be a lie that your husband is overseas. I saw him with my own eyes. The culprit is definitely your husband," she shouted, her face flushed with anger. I was furious that she still accused my husband of groping, but proving his innocence was my priority with the police involved. I kept my composure and said, "Should I call my husband right now?" I pulled out my phone from my apron pocket. I knew he might be busy, but it was nighttime where he was, right around the end of his workday. The police officers seemed uneasy, and she looked tense, but I dialed his number anyway, silently hoping he would pick up. Thankfully, he answered immediately. Seeing his face on the screen brought me a wave of relief. I quickly explained everything, the accusation, and how she claimed he had groped her on a train. He was puzzled at first, but as I told him more and he noticed the police, he quickly grasped the situation. Calmly, he addressed the officers. "As you can see, I'm not even in the country, so I couldn't have done this." He then turned the camera to show the view outside his window. The screen showed an exotic city under a dark sky, clearly somewhere abroad. There was no mistaking it. He added, "If you need proof, I can show you my passport. I've been overseas for 3 years." He retrieved his passport from a nearby bag, showing the stamped pages as evidence. "If you still have doubts, feel free to investigate further," he offered. One of the officers, now looking apologetic, said, "No, that's not necessary. Thank you for your cooperation." After I ended the call, the officer turned to her with a stern expression. "What's going on here?" She was already pale, her eyes wide with shock. "But I didn't know he was overseas." "I was sure it was him," she stammered, her voice shaky. It was as good as a confession. I stepped closer, my voice firm. "Then why did you think it was my husband? You said you saw him clearly. Was it just a mistake?" She snapped, her voice rising. "It's all your fault," she yelled, even as the officers watched in disbelief. "You bought that house and started acting like you were better than everyone. We were supposed to be apartment buddies, but you betrayed me. I wanted to make you pay, so I framed your husband." She was ranting, her anger spilling out uncontrollably. Her selfish words left both me and the officer in shock. She held a grudge because I bought a house, and she tried to frame my husband for groping to get settlement money. This was far beyond simple harassment. Thankfully, since he was abroad, we avoided a false accusation. But if he had been in the country and on that train, it could have been catastrophic. I've heard that once accused of groping, proving innocence is incredibly difficult. False accusations like this are unforgivable. Yet she didn't grasp the seriousness of her actions. Despite her rage, she suddenly switched to a casual tone and said, "Well, let's just call it a mistake. I only wanted to teach a cheeky woman a lesson." I was furious at her blight and lack of remorse. "We'll see who gets punished," I replied. "What did you say?" she shrieked, lunging at me again, but the police officers restrained her and took her away. A while later, her husband came to apologize. He told me that she was arrested for making a false accusation and received a suspended sentence. He had been worried about her bad-mouthing me, but never thought she would go so far as to falsely accuse my husband. He was deeply shaken. With tears in his eyes, he apologized over and over. He also informed me that he would be divorcing her. She had constantly nagged him to earn more and complained about their apartment. This incident was the final straw for him. Now she was completely alone, with no job history and a criminal record. She would struggle to make it in society, but that was the result of her own choices. I did worry about her child, but I later learned that the child was now living with the grandparents and happily attending school. That was a relief. As for me, nearly having my husband framed by a jealous friend was a close call. Recently, he told me he might return home soon. My daughter and I are eagerly awaiting his return, and we plan to continue living happily in our beloved home. Goodbye, everyone.